In this video we're going to look at the corticobulbar input to the cranial nerve nuclei. So on the screen we can see some important landmarks. We can see the pre-central gyrus here, and we can see one over here on the right hand side. We can see the internal capsule, and specifically for the corticobulbar fibers we recognize the genu of the internal capsule, that region between the anterior and the posterior limb that allows these corticobulbar fibers to pass from the cortex to the brainstem. And here we have the brainstem, we have the midbrain, we have the pons, and we have the medulla. So let's draw out the cranial nerve nuclei that these corticobulbar fibers are going to pass to, and to do that first of all we just need to draw a quick midline down through the brainstem, because these cranial nerve nuclei are paired. We have both left and right versions, and they're associated with the cranial nerves that contain motor fibers. So if we remember the cranial nerves that contain these motor fibers, then we can have the three that are associated with the extraocular muscles. So we can have the oculomotor nucleus, we can have the trochlear nucleus, and we can have the abducens nucleus. And these are going to be the nuclei that send away those lower motor neurons. So here, for example, if we were to have the abducens nucleus, this will give rise to the abducens nerve, which contains lower motor neurons, and the lower motor neurons are within the individual cranial nerves as they pass towards the muscles, and these lower motor neurons are going to be fed into, are going to receive innervation via the upper motor neurons. So if we carry on with the various cranial nerve nuclei, then we can draw out the trigeminal motor nucleus. So we've got the trigeminal motor nucleus here. We've drawn out the ocular motor, we've drawn out the trochlear, and we've drawn out the abducens nuclei. And then we can move down onto a larger nucleus. This is the facial nucleus, and we'll return to this in a moment. Then we can carry on and draw quite a large nucleus, and this is for two cranial nerves. This is for cranial nerves 9 and 10, the glossopharyngeal and the vagus. And then the final two nuclei, we have one for the accessory, cranial nerve number 11, and also cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal. Coming from these cranial nerve nuclei are going to be the lower motor neurons, which we saw here for the abducens, and we could add another one here for the trigeminal. And these are what we know, what we can physically see when we look at a dissected head and neck. The large trigeminal nerve passing out from the lateral aspect of the pons, containing the lower motor neurons. Passing into these cranial nerve nuclei are going to be the corticobulbar fibers, or the upper motor neurons. Remember, it takes two motor neurons to pass from the cortex to the muscle, and in the spinal cord they synapse at the ventral grey horn. In the brainstem for the head and neck they synapse in these cranial nerve nuclei. So let's start by drawing out these corticobulbar fibers, and they're going to originate in the pre-central gyrus, so we can see one here. Or for the oculomotor and the other extraocular nuclei, they originate from other parts of the frontal lobe. But we can just assume they come from this pre-central gyrus, this frontal lobe, this motor region, and they're going to pass down through the internal capsule, and they're going to pass towards these cranial nerve nuclei. And for the majority of the cranial nerve nuclei, they receive bilateral innervation. That means that the corticobulbar fibers from this right hand side is going to supply both the ipsilateral and the contralateral cranial nerve nuclei, and these are our upper motor neurons. We can then imagine that this fiber is just passing down and it goes towards the trochlear nucleus. It could then carry on and it goes to the abducens nucleus, and here we can see it synapsing with a lower motor neuron. So now we can see this 2-neuron chain. Remember, you're going to have a whole series of these corticobulbar upper motor neuron fibers leaving from the specific region of the precentral gyrus that is for that specific muscle. Remember, the precentral gyrus is divided into those regions which apply to certain muscles. So we'll have a whole series of these descending upper motor neurons passing to their respective cranial nerve nuclei. We can apply the same rule to the trigeminal nucleus, and here we can see it receiving bilateral innervation. If we then just move to the facial nucleus, then we can see that this is actually slightly different, because we have both an upper portion to the nucleus and a lower portion, and these two upper and lower portions relate to the upper face and to the lower face. So lower motor neurons that are coming from this upper face region pass to the muscles of the upper face, and neurons, lower motor neurons passing from the lower face portion, pass to the musculature on the lower part of the face. So this cranial nerve nuclei has been divided. So what is the corticobulbar input? Well, it's slightly different. For the upper regions of the facial nucleus, it once again receives bilateral innervation, so as you would expect. The difference is for the lower portion of the face, the lower portion of the facial nucleus, because this only receives contralateral innervation. It does not receive innervation bilaterally. So we have bilateral innervation for the upper portion of the facial nucleus, but we only have contralateral innervation for the lower portion. And this is really quite important when we think about facial paralysis. We'll deal with that in a subsequent video. If we then follow this down, we can then go towards the nucleus for the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve, and we see this returns to the bilateral innervation. And the same rule applies for the accessory nerve. The final exception to this is for the hypoglossal nerve, which only receives contralateral innervation. The hypoglossal nucleus only receives contralateral innervation from these descending corticobulbar fibers. So whereas the majority receive bilateral innervation, the hypoglossal nucleus only receives innervation from the contralateral side. And here we can see the hypoglossal nucleus giving rise to its own lower motor neuron. This is important if we think about upper motor neuron lesions and lower motor neuron lesions for the hypoglossal nerve and its nucleus. Because if you were to have an upper motor neuron lesion, then it would be the contralateral tongue muscles that would be atrophying, that would lose their muscle mass and would create these fasciculations. So an upper motor neuron lesion, because it would end up paralyzing the contralateral musculature, when the tongue is protruded, it would actually deviate away from the lesion. So it would deviate to the contralateral side. Whereas if we have a lesion of the lower motor neuron, that's the hypoglossal nerve, or the within the neck, then we're going to have deviation towards the lesion. It would deviate to the ipsilateral side, the same side as the lesion. And this is all due to the way that the upper motor neuron innervates the hypoglossal nucleus. It's not served bilaterally. It's only served via the contralateral upper motor neurons.